There are cases in my chronicles of Sherlock Holmes so unnatural, so grotesquely tinged with the macabre, that I hesitated long before setting them to paper. For even a physician's hand may falter when faced with death that wears a smile. It was in those uneasy months between triumph and tragedy, when the city of London lay beneath its eternal fog, that a summons reached us at Baker Street, a summons that spoke not of burglary or blackmail, but of a man found upright in his chair, lips pulled into a ghastly grin, as though some unseen hand had carved mirth upon the dead. What followed drew Holmes and me into a house where superstition was dressed as science, where tokens grinned like demons in the firelight, and where the silence of midnight was broken only by the echo of a locked room and a smile that would not fade. This is the matter I record as Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Smiling Corpse. You're listening to Detective Street, where untold mysteries find their voice. And if you enjoy this story, consider subscribing and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Chapter 1. The Letter with the Grinning Coin. The morning had dawned with that peculiar quality of light which London reserves for her most deceptive moods, when the fog, having spent the night in contemplation of its sins, hangs undecided in the thoroughfares, like a theatre curtain awaiting the prompter's signal. From my seat by the window of our rooms at 221 B. Baker Street, I could observe the grey veil shifting and thinning over the rooftops, revealing here a chimney pot, there a weathercock, as though the city itself were slowly waking from troubled dreams. Holmes had spent the previous night in one of his characteristic pursuits, a chemical experiment of such noisome and penetrating character that Mrs. Hudson had twice threatened to summon the police, and once actually descended to the street corner before her better nature prevailed. The sitting-room still bore evidence of his nocturnal labours. Beakers and retorts cluttered the sideboard. A peculiar greenish stain marked the hearthrug, and the air carried that acrid, medicinal tang which I had learned to associate with my friend's more ambitious investigations into the properties of alkaloids. Holmes himself lay extended upon the settee in his old purple dressing-gown, that faded garment which he refused to relinquish, despite Mrs. Hudson's repeated offers to consign it to the dustbin. His long, nervous fingers were steepled beneath his angular chin, and his eyes were closed in that attitude of repose which often preceded his most active periods. Yet I knew him well enough to perceive that he was not asleep, but rather in that curious state of suspended animation which he cultivated when the world failed to provide sufficient stimulation for his restless intellect. "I perceive," said he, without opening his eyes, and with that peculiar drawling tone he adopted when making his observations appear effortless, "that your patient has prescribed you an early constitutional, Watson, and that you have partaken of, yes, ham, rather than your customary kippers for breakfast." I could not suppress a laugh. "Your nostrils betray you, Holmes. The smell of Mrs. Hudson's frying pan is hardly a basis for deduction." "On the contrary, my dear fellow," he returned, finally opening those keen grey eyes and fixing me with a look of mild reproach. "It is your boot leather that betrays you. The peculiar pattern of mud upon your right heel speaks of the crossing at Marylebone Road, where they are laying new paving stones. You have taken your constitutional in that direction, unusual for you, as you generally prefer the park. Ergo, some patient residing in that quarter has summoned you early. As for the ham, I confess that my olfactory sense did play its part, though I might equally have deduced it from the slight grease spot upon your waistcoat, which is positioned higher than would result from kippers, and—" He would have continued in this vein, elaborating upon trifles with that particular satisfaction he derived from demonstrating his methods, had not our bell pealed with unwonted urgency, a sharp, insistent clangor that spoke of nerves at breaking point. A moment later, we heard Mrs. Hudson's measured tread upon the stairs, and then she ushered into our presence a young woman whose appearance instantly commanded attention. She was perhaps 25, dressed in the simple dark clothes of a domestic servant, with a maid's cap perched upon hair that had been hastily pinned. Her face was pale as candle wax, and her quick, darting eyes suggested a mind driven near to distraction. In her gloved hands she twisted a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, and I observed that her fingers trembled with a fine, continuous tremor. "If you please, gentlemen," she blurted out, the words tumbling forth before Mrs. Hudson had properly closed the door. "They do say there's a curse upon the house, and I'll not sleep another night under that roof if what I saw by the light of dawn was the work of nature. I'll take my character and go into service elsewhere, but I'll not stay where such things can happen. Not for all the wages in London." Holmes had risen from the settee with that extraordinary rapidity which always seemed at odds with his habitual languor. "Sit down, my dear young lady," said he, and his voice had assumed that combination of gentleness and command which I had observed make the most agitated clients grow calm against their will. "Mrs. Hudson, perhaps some tea. Now then, your name?" "Eliza Merrow, sir, if it please you." She perched upon the edge of the basket chair, her back rigid. "I am, that is, I was, housemaid at Wisteria House in St. John's Wood, the residence of Mr. Ambrose Vale." I saw Holmes's eyelids flicker with recognition. The theatrical impresario of some years since, a collector of curiosities and theatrical memorabilia, if I recall correctly. I believe I read of his acquisition of several Sanskrit manuscripts some months ago. "The very same gentleman, sir." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "He is dead, Mr. Holmes. We found him not an hour after midnight struck, sitting at his writing desk as though he were still composing his correspondence. And smiling, sir. Smiling as if some wicked artist had painted that expression upon his face, and it would not come off for love nor money." She shuddered violently, and I hastened to pour her some water from the carafe. Holmes, meanwhile, had seated himself opposite her, his whole frame alert with that hunting intensity I knew so well. "I must ask you to compose yourself, Miss Merrow, and relate the circumstances with as much precision as you can muster. Begin with yesterday evening. What was the household routine?" She drew a steadying breath and commenced her narrative in a somewhat calmer fashion. Mr. Vale, she explained, had supped quietly with his small household. His wife, Mrs. Isadora Vale, once celebrated as the toast of the Adelphi Theatre. Mr. Peregrine Crowell, who had been Mr. Vale's partner in some apothecary investment venture, and Dr. Julius Alderney, the family physician who called regularly to monitor Mr. Vale's delicate constitution. The meal had been unremarkable, though Mrs. Vale had seemed particularly anxious, and Mr. Vale himself had been in a subdued, thoughtful mood. After supper, Mr. Vale had retired to his study, his custom when he had correspondence to attend to. He had locked the door from within, as was his habit when he wished not to be disturbed. The household had gradually settled for the night. "It was near to midnight, sir," Miss Merrow continued, her voice gaining strength as she warmed to her tale. "When I was making my final rounds, I sleep in the attic, you see, and must pass through the upper corridor. I noticed a peculiar smell emanating from beneath the study door. It was not unpleasant exactly, but strange, like old flowers left too long in a vase, sir, sweet and heavy at once. I thought perhaps the master had upset his potpourri. She had mentioned it to Sims, the valet, who had gone to investigate. Finding the door locked and receiving no response to his knocking, and being alarmed by the unusual silence within, he had fetched Mr. Crowell. Together they had applied their shoulders to the door, which yielded after several attempts. "And there he sat, gentlemen," said Miss Merrow, and her voice trembled anew. "There he sat at his desk, his pen still in his hand, and upon his face such a smile as I never wish to see again in this life. His lips were drawn back, pulled back, sir, so that all his teeth showed, and his eyes were wide and staring, and his hands were clenched upon the arms of his chair, as though he'd been gripping them with all his strength. It was not a smile of pleasure, Mr. Holmes. It was a smile of agony. Holmes's fingers had formed a steeple before his lips. The window? Nailed shut, sir, on account of a burglary scare some months past, and the key was in the lock on the inside. Dr. Alderney was sent for at once. He lives but 3 streets distant, and pronounced life extinct. He could find no mark upon the body, no wound, nothing to account for death. Only that dreadful smile. "Most singular," murmured Holmes. "And this parcel you have brought?" Miss Merrow extended the package with evident reluctance. "This came in the evening post, sir, addressed to Mr. Vale. The butler gave it to him at supper, and I saw him open it. He went quite pale, sir, and thrust it into his pocket without a word. After we found him, Mrs. Vale discovered it had fallen beneath his desk. She bade me bring it to you, along with the note that accompanied it." Holmes unwrapped the brown paper with careful fingers. Within lay a cheap brass token of the sort that tradesmen issue as advertisements, perhaps an inch in diameter. Upon one face had been roughly stamped or etched the image of a grotesque face with an exaggerated, leering grin. The craftsmanship was crude, almost deliberately ugly. Accompanying the token was a half-sheet of paper, written in a cramped, angular hand. "He shall smile when Semna grins." No signature, no address. Holmes held the token to the morning light, angling it this way and that. Then, to my astonishment, he raised it to his nose and inhaled deeply. Finally, and I confess this action made even my professional sensibilities recoil, he touched the tip of his tongue briefly to its surface before wiping it fastidiously with his handkerchief. "Violet copying ink," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "Recently applied, I should say within the past 3 days. The paper, a cheap provincial stationer's stock, common enough, and Semna, now that is suggestive. An allusion, no doubt, to some idol or artifact in Mr. Vale's collection. He was known for his enthusiasm for the macabre and exotic." He placed the token carefully upon the mantelpiece, where it rested among his regiment of pipes, its graven grin seeming to mock us from the shadows. "You will come, sir." Miss Merrow's voice was pleading. "Mrs. Vale is beside herself, and Mr. Crowell talks of curses and ancient vengeances. The police inspector, a Lestrade, I believe, has been called. But Mrs. Vale insists that only you can pierce the veil of this mystery." Holmes had already moved to the door where his various disguises and accoutrements hung upon their pegs. "My dear Miss Merrow," said he, taking down not his usual overcoat, but rather his violin case, that battered leather repository which I knew contained not his Stradivarius, but rather certain specialized instruments of his profession. "We shall be at Wisteria House before the fog has finally made up its mind to either commit itself or disperse. Watson, your revolver, I think, though I anticipate no physical danger. The menace here is of a more subtle character." As we descended to the street, where Miss Merrow's cab waited at the curb, I caught a final glimpse of that brass token upon our mantelpiece. Its fixed grin seemed to follow us, and I could not entirely suppress a shudder as I thought of the dead man sitting at his desk, his face frozen in that same terrible rictus. Holmes had already descended into that focused silence which indicated his mind was racing ahead, following trails of evidence invisible to ordinary eyes. The fog swirled about us as our hansom clattered north toward St. John's Wood, and I found myself conscious, as I had been so often in Holmes's company, of the weight of some unseen design pressing upon the morning air, a pattern of malice and cunning that my friend alone could perceive and unravel. Chapter 2. Wisteria House and the Locked Study. The journey to St. John's Wood carried us through streets still wrapped in morning mist, past shuttered shops and lamplighters, making their weary rounds after a night's vigil. Holmes sat in silence, his lean profile sharp against the grey light filtering through the cab window, his eyes half closed in that attitude of concentration which I had learned meant he was constructing elaborate edifices of theory upon foundations I could not yet perceive. Wisteria House, when we reached it, proved to be one of those prim, respectable villas which line the quieter streets of that district, whitewashed, with an iron fence painted black, scrubbed steps, and window boxes that spoke of careful maintenance. It had the air of a house that had been washed and starched and put out to air, as though respectability could be achieved through vigorous application of soap and blacking. Yet the moment we crossed the threshold, that impression of suburban propriety fell away like a discarded mask. The interior spoke in another, far more theatrical voice. The entrance hall was lined with glass cases, each containing some oddment of stagecraft, a collection that suggested both a passion for the dramatic and an appetite for the grotesque. I observed masks with fixed expressions of tragedy and comedy, their painted features cracked with age, stage swords whose blades had been dulled with rouge to simulate gore, a collection of false hands and wax fingers arranged like some ghoulish bouquet, and, most striking of all, a small wooden idol of dark tropical wood, perhaps 8 inches in height, whose teeth had been gilded so that they gleamed with an unnatural brilliance in a frozen grin of malevolent amusement. "The god Semna, I presume," murmured Holmes, pausing before this last exhibit. "Or rather, a theatrical representation of some Javanese spirit deity. Note the craftsmanship, Watson. European work attempting to suggest Eastern mysticism. Mr. Vale appears to have been a man who appreciated atmosphere." Mrs. Isadora Vale received us in the drawing-room, a woman of perhaps 45 years, handsome rather than beautiful, dressed in black that seemed less the spontaneous expression of grief than a costume selected for effect. Her eyes, though reddened, possessed that particular quality I had observed in actresses, a self-awareness a consciousness of being observed even in the midst of genuine emotion. She had been a celebrated beauty in her theatrical days, and though time and artifice had faded that glory, traces remained of what must have been a commanding presence upon the stage. "If there is justice in this world," she said, and her voice carried that trained resonance which could fill a theatre, "you will tear the veil from this horror, Mr. Holmes. My husband collected curious things, exotic things, sometimes disturbing things. But he did not deserve to become their victim. There are those who whisper of curses and retribution, but I tell you plainly, Ambrose Vale was murdered, and by human agency, not supernatural fancy." Dr. Julius Alderney rose from his chair by the fire, a neat, compact man of middle years, with anxious whiskers and the careful movements of one accustomed to handling delicate instruments. He bowed to us with professional courtesy. "I am ashamed to confess, Mr. Holmes, that I can furnish no natural cause of death. I have examined the body most carefully. There is no wound, no mark of violence, no sign of poison that I can detect. I thought initially of tetanus, as Vale's gardener had pricked his finger upon a rusty nail only yesterday, but the onset is far too swift for that diagnosis. The smile," he hesitated. "It bears resemblance to the rhesus sardonicus one observes in certain convulsive disorders, particularly strychnine poisoning. Yet I detected no trace of bitterness about the lips, and the rapidity of the death is inconsistent with the usual progress of such cases." "Most instructive," said Holmes. "And the room itself?" "I understand it was locked from within." Sims, the valet, stepped forward, a trustworthy-looking fellow of the old school, with grey in his hair and that air of dignified competence which marks the superior servant. "Locked from the inside, sir, with the key in the lock. I can testify to that with certainty, for it was my shoulder, along with Mr. Crowell's, that forced the door. The window has been nailed shut these 4 months past, ever since we had a scare about burglars in the neighbourhood. Mr. Vale was most particular about his security, having valuable items in his collection." "Then let us examine the scene," said Holmes briskly. "Time degrades evidence as surely as rain washes away footprints." We mounted the stairs to the study, a room at the rear of the first floor, looking out over a small, well-kept garden now shrouded in fog. The chamber itself presented a curious contrast to the theatrical clutter of the rest of the house. Here all was sober and austere, oak panelling dark with age, a Persian carpet of subdued pattern, a writing desk of good quality positioned to receive the window light, and a small coal fire that had burned low in the grate. Mr. Ambrose Vale sat in his writing chair as death had found him, for Dr. Alderney had insisted the body remain undisturbed until Holmes could examine the scene. He had been a man of perhaps 60 years, with grey whiskers and a frame that had once been powerful, but had run somewhat to flesh. His evening dress was impeccable, his linen crisp, but it was his face that drew and held the eye with terrible fascination. The smile, for so it must be called, though the word seemed a mockery, was of that dreadful variety which distorts rather than adorns the human countenance. The lips were retracted fully, displaying all the teeth in a ghastly grin. The cheeks were drawn back and taut, as though invisible strings had been attached and pulled with cruel force. The eyes were wide and staring, with an expression that mingled horror and surprise. It was not the face of a man who had died peacefully. yet neither did it suggest the usual signs of violent death. Holmes moved about the room with that peculiar gliding motion which made him seem to float rather than walk. He was utterly absorbed, his keen face bent forward, his shoulders bowed, his lips compressed. He sniffed the air repeatedly, much as a hound quarters a field. He peered minutely at the key in the lock, examining it from both sides with his lens. He knelt upon the carpet and studied the narrow slit beneath the door, pressing his cheek to the floor in a posture that would have seemed comical had the circumstances been less grim. He examined the ashes in the fireplace with infinite care, lifting a pinch between forefinger and thumb, rubbing it gently, holding it to his nose. Upon the writing desk he found a tipped snuff-box of silver, its lid open, a small quantity of brown snuff scattered across the green leather writing surface. A curious blue smear marked the rim of the box, and this Holmes scraped carefully with his penknife, preserving the sample in an envelope from his pocket. "Watson," said he at length, straightening from his examination, "you will observe several points of interest. First, the lamp. It contains no petroleum. It has been empty for some hours, yet Mr. Vale was writing by lamplight according to the household. How, then, did he illuminate his work? Second, that faint odour which Miss Merrow described as old flowers. You perceive it still? Heavy, cloying, with a slightly bitter undertone. Third, the blotter. Observe the shape of that ink stain. Curiously, like a leaf, is it not? And fourth, the dust beneath the door. I fancy I can perceive, yes, a faint linear disturbance, as though something had been drawn through the gap." He rose and dusted his hands. "We must interview the household separately. Let us begin with Mr. Crewell." "Takam." Peregrine Crowell proved to be a jovial, heavy man with florid features and a too-wide smile that showed large yellowing teeth. He wore a checked waistcoat of pronounced pattern and spoke with that hearty manner which sometimes conceals more than it reveals. "A dreadful blow, Mr. Holmes, a dreadful blow indeed." He mopped his forehead with a handkerchief. "Poor Vale had been in low spirits of late, considering his affairs, you understand, insurance policies and such. One must settle one's business at a certain age, eh? Mortality, Mr. Holmes, forces us all to contemplate the inevitable. I had been advising him to take courage, to enjoy his collections, not to dwell upon morbid thoughts. You were his business partner in a minor venture some years ago, an investment in apothecary supplies, surgical instruments, and medicinal compounds. We made a modest profit, though Vale withdrew his interest last year. We remained on friendly terms, however. I dined here regularly." Mrs. Vale, when questioned again, trembled as she described the anonymous note and token. Ambrose was fascinated by such things, mysteries, curiosities, theatrical effects. But recently he had become nervous, anxious. He spoke of old debts, old sins, though he would not elaborate. I thought it merely the melancholy of advancing years. Dr. Alderney persisted in his tetanus theory, though with decreasing conviction under Holmes's penetrating questions. The smile is the key, Mr. Holmes. It is pathognomonic of certain conditions, tetanus, strychnine, occasionally hysteria of extreme form. Yet none of these perfectly fit the circumstances. Miss Merrow, summoned again, provided a curious detail. "When we broke in, sir, I noticed something on the floor, a line in the dust under the door, like when you draw a string along. I thought it strange at the time, but in all the confusion—" Sims confirmed that the snuff box had been freshly filled the previous day, at Mr. Vale's request. He was particular about his snuff, sir. Took it from a special tobacconist in Marylebone. I had the box filled not 24 hours before his death. Holmes listened to each testimony with his head inclined slightly to one side, like a conductor hearing themes and variations in an unfamiliar symphony. His fingers drummed occasionally against his thigh, the only outward sign of the rapid calculations proceeding behind those hooded eyes. At last he rose and addressed the company. "There is work yet to be done here before the pattern becomes clear. Inspector Lestrade shall have his locked room to puzzle over, but I may be permitted to pick the lock of superstition before he applies his more orthodox methods. Mrs. Vale, I shall require access to your late husband's study for some hours. Dr. Alderney, you will remain available for consultation. Watson, we have inquiries to make in the neighborhood." As we departed that chamber of death, I glanced back once at the figure in the chair. The firelight had faded to embers, and in the dimness that terrible smile seemed almost to waver, as though the dead man might at any moment abandon his grim jest and speak. The idol's grin watched us from its case in the hall below, and I felt as though we were leaving that house not more enlightened, but rather more deeply enmeshed in a web of theatrical mystification. A web whose spider Holmes alone could hope to locate and expose. The fog had thickened during our visit, and as our cab rattled back toward Baker Street, I found myself reflecting upon the curious mingling of the grotesque and the methodical which characterized this case. A locked room, a smiling corpse, an anonymous warning with its graven token, all the elements of sensation fiction. Yet Holmes had fastened upon particles invisible to my eye. An empty lamp, a blue smear, a line in dust. He had already, I felt certain, begun to perceive the outline of truth beneath the painted scenery of mystery, as a careful observer might detect the sketch beneath the finished canvas. Chapter 3. Masks, red herrings, and an idol's grin. The case, as such cases will, began to widen and complicate, like ripples spreading from a stone cast into still water, or perhaps more aptly, like a tide that begins imperceptibly at the margins, but gradually floods the entire shore. The following day brought Inspector Lestrade of the Yard, starchly polite and professionally sceptical, to catalogue the usual impossibilities: locked door, nailed window, no weapon, no poison detected. He regarded Holmes with that mixture of grudging respect and irritation which marked their professional relationship. "A pretty puzzle, Mr. Holmes," said he, settling into our sitting-room with notebook and pencil. "The Yard has seen locked rooms before, but never one quite so theatrical. This Vale fellow seems to have died of nothing at all, save that smile upon his face. The widow stands to inherit a considerable sum. There's a life insurance policy, newly arranged, that would pay out handsomely. The partner, this Crowell, has debts. The doctor had access to poisons. Take your pick of suspects, but try finding evidence that would convince a jury." Holmes, who had been staring moodily out our window at the grey morning, turned with sudden animation. "Has the insurance policy been signed?" "Not yet. Was to be finalized this very week." "Interesting. And Crowell's debts? Of what nature?" "Gaming, mostly. Cards and horses. Nothing desperate, but enough to make a man uncomfortable." After Lestrade departed, Holmes dispatched me with a note to a certain tobacconist in Marylebone, Mr. Bristow of Hanover Street. while he himself vanished on one of those sudden expeditions which his friends must accept as part of his curious economy of energy. He would offer no explanation, save that he had inquiries to pursue in propria persona, by which I understood he meant in disguise. Mr. Bristow's establishment proved to be one of those old-fashioned shops that line the quieter streets of Marylebone. Bow-windowed, fragrant with Virginia and Turkish leaf, its interior dark and womb-like after the brightness of the street. The proprietor himself was a dried-up little man with shrewd eyes and tobacco-stained fingers, who remembered Mr. Vale with perfect clarity. "A gentleman of the old school, sir," said he, measuring out a careful ounce of Latakia. "Took a dark Cavendish for his pipe, and a gentleman's snuff. Brown rappy with a touch of attar. Liked to show the old ways to his visitors, he did. Snuff-taking is a dying art, Dr. Watson. The modern generation prefers cigars, or worse, these filthy cigarettes." He sniffed disapprovingly. "The snuff-box was filled recently, I understand." 2 days since, sir, at the behest of his valet. A good fellow, that Sims, always precise in his requirements. "Any peculiarity in the snuff itself?" Mr. Bristow frowned, his fingers pausing in their measuring. "Well now, sir, there was one oddment. Mr. Vale had requested, some months back, a small quantity of riddle dust mixed in. Indigo, you understand. Some actors fancy it for a trick at cards, or for theatrical effects. Colours the fingers blue, temporary-like, useful for suggesting a mysterious Eastern gentleman, or some such stage business. Not to my taste, sir. Seems like vanity. But customers have their whims. It's harmless enough, save to the dignity of the snuff itself." I thanked him and made my way back to Baker Street, where I found Holmes had returned before me. He had shed the shabby coat and muffler of a street hawker, and now stood before the fire in his dressing-gown, his eyes dancing with that peculiar light which indicated a successful reconnaissance. "You've been disguised again," I observed, noting the theatrical make-up still faintly visible at his hairline. "Indeed, Watson. I have been a beggar in St. John's Wood, a most instructive occupation. There are eyes that will open to a beggar which remain firmly shut to a gentleman. The poor observe everything. They must, for survival depends upon reading the faces and moods of their betters." And what did those observant eyes reveal? Holmes threw himself into his chair and lit a cigarette, drawing upon it with evident satisfaction. "That Mr. Crowell is considerably less prosperous than his checked waistcoats and hearty manner would suggest. His creditors call regularly at his lodgings in Kensington, and his landlady reports that the rent is 3 weeks in arrears. That Dr. Alderney keeps hours unusual for a physician with a quiet suburban practice. He was observed leaving his surgery at 11 o'clock on the night of the murder, and did not return until past midnight. And that Mrs. Vale, for all her professed grief, was heard laughing, actually laughing, Watson, with unusual gaiety, only 2 hours after her husband's body was discovered." He exhaled a plume of smoke and watched it curl towards the ceiling. "Further, I have made the acquaintance of a chemist's boy who remembers filling certain prescriptions for Dr. Alderney, including one for medicinal strychnine, signed with the doctor's own hand, not 3 weeks since. The lad also recalls that his master prints his labels upon a distinctive blue tissue paper, a peculiarity of the establishment. The blue smear from the snuff-box. Precisely. And you, Watson, what news from the tobacconist? I related my conversation with Mr. Bristow, particularly the detail about the indigo riddle dust. Holmes nodded slowly. The riddle dust explains the blue staining, though not its presence in such quantity upon the rim of the box. No, Watson, I fancy we are dealing with something more sinister than theatrical vanity. Consider. The snuff was freshly prepared, yet Vale died of what appears to be strychnine poisoning, or at least something that produces the characteristic risus sardonicus. The locked room suggests suicide or natural death. The anonymous note and token suggest ancient curse or supernatural agency. Yet underneath this theatrical pageantry, I perceive the outlines of a very human malice. He rose and began pacing, that restless prowling which always indicated his mind was working at high speed. "But Holmes," I protested, "the idol, the name Semna. Surely there is some significance to the Eastern connection." He waved a dismissive hand. "Semna is merely a theatrical corruption of Semangat, the sole spirit of Javanese folklore. Mr. Vale collected such curiosities. Any visitor to his house would know of his interest in exotic superstitions. Someone has used that knowledge to construct a mystery, to direct our attention toward the fantastic when the truth lies in more prosaic channels. Observe, Watson, we are meant to see an impossible crime, a locked room, an Eastern curse. But I see a door that was never truly locked from within, a smile that is not supernatural, but physiological, and motives as old as Cain, greed, jealousy, fear." At that moment, Lestrade burst in upon our consultation, bringing with him news that confirmed Holmes's suspicions about the insurance policy. The agents had indeed been consulted only the previous week, and the policy, when signed, would pay out the considerable sum of £5,000, chiefly to Mrs. Vale, though there were smaller bequests to the household staff. "The widow had motive," said Lestrade bluntly, "and opportunity, living in the house. The door being locked from within makes it difficult, I grant you. But there are ways, tricks that theatrical folk might know. I'm minded to bring her in for questioning, Mr. Holmes." Holmes, who generally held the official police in low regard, shook his head. "You would be premature, Lestrade. Mrs. Vale did not kill her husband. Of that I am reasonably certain. But she may know who did, or at least suspect. Give me another day. I have experiments to conduct, and then, perhaps, we shall illuminate this mystery with something stronger than gaslight." After the inspector departed, muttering about irregular methods and the commissioner's expectations, Holmes sat down at his chemical bench and began assembling a curious array of materials, the sample of blue-stained snuff he had scraped from the rim of the box, various reagents and acids, and a small brazier for heating compounds. "What are you testing for?" I inquired. "For the presence of an alkaloid poison that can be masked by other bitter substances, that acts rapidly upon the nervous system, and that produces the characteristic risus sardonicus. There are not many candidates, Watson. Strychnine is the obvious choice, but there are others. Gelsomine, for instance, or certain extracts of the nux vomica plant. The blue staining suggests contamination from some external source, perhaps from the paper wrapping used by the chemist, or perhaps from deliberate mixing with the indigo dust to mask visual detection." He worked in silence for some time, occasionally making notes, once or twice bringing a test tube to his nose with extreme caution. Finally he straightened, and I saw his expression shift to one of grim satisfaction. "Strychnine," he announced, mixed cunningly with quinine to mask the taste, for strychnine alone is fearfully bitter, and adulterated with the indigo dust, perhaps to explain away any discoloration. A small quantity would be needed. A single resolute pinch, taken by an unsuspecting victim, would suffice. The convulsions would follow within minutes. Death would be rapid, but agonizing. The facial muscles would contract in precisely the pattern we observed. But the locked room, Holmes! Even granting the poison, how was it administered if the door was locked from within? A peculiar smile crossed his face. That, Watson, is the one genuinely clever element in an otherwise rather obvious scheme. Come, we must return to Baker Street's stores of miscellany. He rummaged in a drawer and produced a length of fine horsehair, a cake of beeswax, and, curiously, our own door key. "Watch carefully," said he, "for I am about to demonstrate one of the oldest tricks in the housebreaker's repertoire, a trick which any theatrical person might know from stage work, and which requires only patience and a steady hand." What followed was a remarkable demonstration. Using the beeswax, he took an impression of our door key by pressing it into the soft wax. Then, with the door closed and the key inserted from the outside, he smeared beeswax upon the bow of the key. He next threaded the horsehair through the keyhole, attached it to the protruding key, and, with movements so delicate they might have been a surgeon's, manipulated the hair so that the key turned in the lock from the outside, then was drawn through the keyhole entirely, rotated, and reinserted from within. You see, Watson? The door now appears locked from the inside, with the key visible in the interior lock. Yet it was I, standing on the outside, who accomplished this feat. The horsehair leaves only the faintest linear mark in any accumulated dust, precisely what Miss Merrow observed. A child's conjuring trick, really, but it will impose upon a Scotland Yard inspector who expects locks to be honest. "Remarkable," I exclaimed. "But, Holmes, this suggests premeditation of the most calculated sort. Someone who knew the house, knew Vale's habits, and knew his weakness for snuff," Holmes finished. "Someone with access to the study, with knowledge of poisons, and with reason to wish Vale dead in a manner that would suggest either natural causes or supernatural intervention. Consider our suspects, Watson. Mrs. Vale, theatrical, with motive of inheritance. Crowell, desperate for money, with past connection to apothecary supplies, and Dr. Alderney, with medical knowledge, access to poisons, and those curious midnight perambulations on the night of the murder." He paused and reached for his violin, not to play, but to hold, running his fingers along its neck in that absent manner which indicated deep thought. But which of them possessed all the necessary elements? The theatrical knowledge for the locked room trick, the medical expertise for the poison, the motive, and, most crucial of all, the opportunity to tamper with that snuff-box. Even as he spoke, a telegram arrived, delivered by one of the Baker Street irregulars. Holmes read it, and I observed the faintest tightening at the corner of his mouth, that subtle indication of a theory confirmed. "From my beggar acquaintance in St. John's Wood," said he, quietly. "Doctor, Alderney was observed leaving his surgery at 11 o'clock on the night of the murder, taking a cab to the end of the lane adjacent to Wisteria House. Not to the house itself, mind you, but to the lane that runs behind the garden. He returned to his surgery at midnight. The cabman remembers him particularly for his fussing about the fare, and, more significantly, for the smell of violets that clung to his gloves. "Violets!" I exclaimed. "The copying ink on the anonymous note." "Precisely. Violet copying ink of the sort used by medical men for their prescriptions and records. I observed a bottle of it upon Dr. Alderney's desk during my visit yesterday. A distinctive shade, not the common blue-black. Further, Watson, consider the medical knowledge required to mask strychnine's bitterness with quinine, to calculate the precise dosage, to understand the progression of symptoms. Consider also the means, access to poisons through legitimate medical channels. And finally, consider the opportunity. A doctor calls upon his patient at all hours without exciting suspicion. His eyes had taken on that fierce inward flame which combined something of the ascetic with something of the hunting falcon. But what of motive, you ask? Ah, Watson, there we approach the eternal triangle. What is love, if not the oldest accomplice of murder? A beautiful woman, faded glory seeking one final passionate attachment. A physician, respectable but lonely, attending regularly upon a household. And a husband grown old, perhaps tyrannical, certainly in the way. You suspect an understanding between Mrs. Vale and Dr. Alderney. I suspect more than understanding. I suspect conspiracy, though perhaps not conscious conspiracy on the lady's part. A word here, a sigh there, a complaint about an oppressive marriage. Such things can plant terrible seeds in an infatuated mind. The doctor, I believe, acted to free Mrs. Vale, convincing himself he was her champion when he was merely her dupe. He set down his violin and reached for his coat. But suspicion is not proof, and proof is what Lestrade and the courts require. We must return to Wisteria House, Watson. There are final confirmations to be made, and then we shall spring the trap. Bring your revolver. Not that I anticipate violence, but a cornered man is unpredictable, even a respectable physician. The afternoon had drawn in by the time we reached St. John's Wood, and a premature dusk, hastened by the ever-present fog, had settled upon the city. The street lamps were being lit as we approached Wisteria House, their wan light making the fog seem almost tangible, like some living substance that pressed against the windows and sought entry at every crack. We found the household in a state of subdued anxiety. Lestrade had been and gone, leaving behind him an atmosphere of suspicion and barely suppressed accusation. Mrs. Vale sat pale and rigid in the drawing-room, while Crowell paced nervously by the fire. Dr. Alderney was present as well, summoned, he explained, to provide Mrs. Vale with a sedative for her nerves. Holmes requested that the snuff-box be brought from the study, and when it arrived, he examined it with his lens, tilting it toward the lamplight. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, though loudly enough for all to hear, "the faintest scraping upon the inner lid. Here, and here, as though some instrument had pried at a concealed compartment. Silver snuff-boxes of this period often possess such features, a small hidden reservoir for particularly precious blends. But this compartment has been opened clumsily, hastily." Dr. Alderney had grown very pale. "Mr. Holmes, I fail to see the relevance." "Then permit me to illuminate it," Holmes interrupted smoothly. "A hidden compartment, opened with some surgical instrument, a probe, perhaps. The pure strychnine placed within, relying upon Mr. Vale's habit of taking a vigorous pinch before writing. The quinine already mixed in the main reservoir to mask the taste. The indigo dust to explain away any discoloration. Quite ingenious, really, save for the small matter of tool marks." He turned to Lestrade, who had materialized in the doorway with 2 constables. "Inspector, I believe Dr. Alderney carries a medical bag. Would you be so kind as to examine its contents?" What followed had the quality of a nightmare, slowly crystallizing into terrible reality. In the doctor's bag was found a slender whalebone probe of the sort used in certain delicate surgical procedures, and upon its tip, when examined under Holmes's lens, the faintest dusting of blue powder, invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakable under magnification. But Holmes was not finished. From his pocket he produced a torn fragment of paper, part of a chemist's label, bearing the letters STRYCHN in characteristic typography. "I retrieved this from the ashes in Vale's fireplace," he said quietly. "The murderer attempted to burn the evidence, but paper burns incompletely in a low fire. The chemist who issued this label has already identified it as his work, and his ledger, which the inspector has secured, shows a recent purchase signed in a hand that attempts disguise, but reveals itself through certain characteristic formations. The letter A, Doctor, gives you away. You form it with a peculiar hooked ascender, a habit ingrained through years of writing prescriptions." The room had gone very still. Mrs. Vale's hand trembled upon the arm of her chair. Crowell had ceased his pacing and stood frozen by the mantelpiece. Dr. Alderney's face had gone from pale to ashen. "You presume much, Mr. Holmes," he said, but his voice was hollow. "On the contrary, I presume nothing. I conclude from evidence. The violet copying ink on the anonymous note matches the bottle in your surgery. The blue ash in Vale's grate matches the distinctive tissue paper your chemist uses for poison wrappers. I have confirmed this through direct inquiry. A cabman places you at the lane behind this house at the hour of the murder, noting particularly the smell of violets on your gloves, from that copying ink, no doubt, transferred when you wrote the note. The whalebone probe bears traces of the blue-stained strychnine, and your knowledge of the locked room trick suggests familiarity with theatrical methods easily acquired through attendance at Mrs. Vale's performances in her theatrical days. Holmes's voice had remained conversational throughout, almost gentle, but beneath the silk I heard iron. "You constructed an elaborate fantasy of Eastern curses and impossible crimes, Doctor. You used Vale's own collection against him, the idol Semna, the theatrical masks, the locked study. You counted upon superstition to cloud the investigation. But you forgot that while men may be fooled by theatrical effects, chemistry does not lie, and tool marks tell their own truth." Dr. Alderney's shoulders sagged. He cast a single glance, pitiful in its naked longing, at Mrs. Vale, who did not return his gaze, but sat frozen, her face a mask that would have done credit to those in her late husband's collection. "He was a cruel man," the doctor whispered. "He collected people as he collected those grotesque masks and idols. He delighted in watching others perform for him, in controlling their expressions, their emotions. He made Isadora, Mrs. Vale, into another of his exhibits, a faded beauty kept on display. I wanted only to free her, to give her the life she deserved." "Your motives," said Holmes coldly, "are for another tribunal. I attend only to means and opportunity, and those you possessed in abundance." Lestrade stepped forward with his handcuffs. "Julius Alderney, I arrest you for the willful murder of Ambrose Vale. You need not say anything, but anything you do say may be used in evidence against you." As they led him away, Dr. Alderney looked back once more at Mrs. Vale. "I did it for you," he said simply. "Only for you." She turned her face away without speaking, and in that gesture I read more than any words could convey. Perhaps shame, perhaps calculation, perhaps merely the instinct for self-preservation that allows the beautiful and the theatrical to survive their own tragedies. The household seemed to exhale collectively as the door closed behind the prisoner and his escort. Crowell poured himself a brandy with shaking hands. Mrs. Vale rose and moved to the window, where she stood gazing out at the fog as though seeking in its obscurity some refuge from the clarity Holmes had imposed. As we departed Wisteria House for the final time, I glanced back at that collection of theatrical curiosities lining the hall. The idol with its gilded grin seemed less sinister now, reduced to what it truly was, a piece of carved wood, given significance only by human fears and human malice. The fog had thickened to true London impenetrability, and our cab moved through streets that seemed to exist in some liminal space between dream and waking. Holmes sat in silence throughout the journey, his profile sharp against the window, where the occasional street lamp cast its feeble glow. I knew him well enough to understand that he took no satisfaction in the exposure of human wickedness, however brilliant the unmasking. He sought truth as a mathematician seeks proof, relentlessly, without passion, with only the fierce joy of the intellect engaged at its highest pitch. Chapter 4. The Experiment of the Key and the Taste of Bitter Truth. That evening, back in the comfortable clutter of our Baker Street rooms, Holmes set about demonstrating his conclusions with that systematic thoroughness which characterized his methods. Mrs. Hudson, having forgiven him for the previous night's chemical assault upon her domestic peace, had laid out a cold supper, though neither of us had much appetite after the afternoon's grim revelations. Upon our table, Holmes arranged the evidence like pieces in some macabre puzzle. The brass token with its leering face, still faintly marked with violet ink. A length of horsehair obtained from some theatrical supplier, a cake of beeswax from his chemical supplies, and our own door key, which was to serve as proxy for the one from Vale's study. "Observe, Watson," said he, his fingers moving with the precision of a watchmaker as he worked, "how simplicity masquerades as impossibility. The locked room mystery has fascinated criminologists and sensation writers for generations, yet the solution is often elementary, a matter of strings and wax and patience." He proceeded to repeat the demonstration he had shown me earlier, but now with additional refinements that revealed the full cunning of the method. First, he took an impression of the key in beeswax, carefully noting the position of the wards. Then, with the door closed and locked from the outside, he applied a thin layer of wax to the bow of the key and threaded his horsehair through the keyhole. "The horsehair must be strong, yet flexible," he explained as he worked. "Strands from a violin bow would serve admirably, and such materials are readily available to anyone with theatrical connections. The wax on the key bow provides just enough adhesion to allow the thread to grip." With movements that would have done credit to a concert violinist, he manipulated the thread, causing the key to turn slowly in the lock from the outside. Then, and this was the most delicate part of the operation, he drew the key entirely through the keyhole by pulling steadily on the thread, rotated it, and reinserted it from the interior side. "The key now rests in the lock, as though it had been turned from within," he concluded, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "A person breaking in would find the door locked and the key visible on the interior side. The only evidence of interference would be a faint line in any dust beneath the door, precisely what Miss Merrow observed, though she did not understand its significance. To complete the illusion, the murderer would only need to ensure he was present when the body was discovered, perhaps even participating in breaking down the door, thus establishing himself as a witness rather than a suspect. "But Holmes," I protested, "this requires considerable skill and practice. How could Dr. Alderney have acquired such expertise?" "Consider his background, Watson. He attended Mrs. Vale during her theatrical career, a physician with stage connections, familiar with theatrical effects and stage machinery. The locked room trick is well known in theatrical circles as a staunt for magicians and illusionists. Dr. Alderney would have had ample opportunity to observe such methods, and perhaps to practice them in anticipation of his crime." Holmes next turned his attention to the poisoned snuff. From his chemical bench he retrieved the sample he had scraped from the rim of Vale's snuff-box, along with various reagents and testing papers. With extreme caution, for he respected the deadliness of alkaloid poisons, he dissolved a few grains in distilled water and subjected them to a series of tests. Strychnine, he confirmed, produces characteristic reactions with certain reagents. Here, observe the color change with potassium dichromate, and here, the crystalline precipitate with picric acid. There can be no doubt. The snuff contained a lethal dose of strychnine, cunningly masked with quinine to obscure the bitter taste. He then performed an experiment that made me profoundly uneasy. Taking a few grains of the adulterated snuff, he placed them carefully upon his tongue, holding them there for the briefest instant before spitting violently into the fire with a grimace of disgust. "Holmes! Good God, man! Peace, Watson. I took only the smallest quantity, insufficient to produce systemic effects, and expelled it before any significant absorption could occur. But you observe my point. The bitterness is partially masked by the quinine, though not entirely. A man taking snuff habitually, expecting the usual mild pungency, might not notice the adulteration until too late. And once swallowed or absorbed through the nasal mucosa, strychnine acts with dreadful swiftness." He rinsed his mouth thoroughly with water, then continued his lecture. The poison would produce its first effects within 15 to 20 minutes. Muscle stiffness, heightened sensitivity to stimuli. Then would come the convulsions, the characteristic risus sardonicus as the facial muscles contract, and finally death by respiratory paralysis. The victim would be conscious throughout, a fact that makes strychnine poisoning particularly cruel. And the blue staining on the snuff-box rim? Ah, that is where Dr. Alderney made his first error. The strychnine was obtained from a chemist who wraps his poisons in distinctive blue tissue as a warning. In transferring the poison to the snuff-box's hidden compartment, traces of this blue dye were left upon the rim. The indigo riddle dust already present in the snuff provided a partial explanation, but the concentration and placement of the staining was inconsistent with ordinary use. A telegram arrived at that moment, brought up by Mrs. Hudson with that particular expression of long suffering which he reserved for late evening interruptions. Holmes read it quickly, and I saw his lips compress into a thin line of satisfaction. "From Lestrade," he said, "they have secured a statement from the chemist's assistant, a lad of 16 who remembers Dr. Alderney purchasing strychnine 3 weeks ago. ostensibly for treating a patient with severe neurological symptoms. The lad also recalls that the doctor seemed nervous and insisted upon wrapping the bottle himself, declining the usual blue tissue warning paper. Further, they have found in Dr. Alderney's surgery a bottle of violet copying ink, identical in shade to that used on the anonymous note. He set down the telegram and reached for his pipe, packing it with that deliberate care which indicated his mind was still working through the final details. The case is complete in all essentials, Watson. We have means, the poisoned snuff and the knowledge to prepare it. We have opportunity, access to the house, familiarity with Vale's habits, and the medical authority to visit without exciting suspicion. We have the physical evidence, the tool marks on the snuff box, the whalebone probe, the torn label from the poison wrapper, the violet ink. And we have motive, though that, I confess, is the element least susceptible to absolute proof. The supposed attachment between Mrs. Vale and Dr. Alderney? More than supposed, Watson. During my inquiries in St. John's Wood, I learned that Dr. Alderney had been calling upon Mrs. Vale with unusual frequency, ostensibly to attend to her husband, but often when Vale was absent at his club or occupied elsewhere. The servants gossiped, as servants will. Whether Mrs. Vale encouraged these attentions or merely accepted them is immaterial from a legal standpoint, though it bears upon the question of her culpability. He drew upon his pipe, exhaling fragrant smoke towards the ceiling. I believe Dr. Alderney convinced himself he was acting chivalrously, rescuing a woman from an unhappy marriage, liberating her to live freely. Men are capable of the most extraordinary self-deception when love, or what they mistake for love, clouds their judgment. He saw himself as hero of a romantic drama when he was merely the villain of a sordid crime. And Mrs. Vale? Holmes was silent for a moment, his keen eyes distant. Mrs. Vale is an actress, Watson, trained to present emotion, to manipulate sympathy, to control how she is perceived. Did she consciously encourage murder? I think not. Did she create an atmosphere in which murder became possible? Almost certainly. She complained of her husband's cruelty, his emotional tyranny, his treatment of her as another curiosity in his collection. She may have meant only to gain sympathy, but Dr. Alderney heard a plea for rescue. Thus is evil born, not from simple malice, but from the corruption of better impulses. He set aside his pipe and rose, moving to the window where the fog pressed against the glass like some living thing seeking entry. The law will hang Dr. Alderney for murder, and rightly so. Whether Mrs. Vale bears moral responsibility is a question for philosophers and theologians. I deal only in evidence and proof. As I prepared to retire for the night, I found myself reflecting upon the curious parallel between the locked room and the human heart. Both could be penetrated by the right methods. Both yielded their secrets to patient observation, yet both remained ultimately mysterious in some essential way. Holmes had unlocked the study's door with horsehair and wax, had unlocked the mystery's solution through chemical analysis and logical deduction. But the final mystery of why love should lead to murder, that remained as impenetrable as the fog that shrouded London's streets. Chapter 5. The smile explained and the lamp relit. Holmes gathered the household of Wisteria House in the drawing-room the following morning, at his request and with Lestrade's official sanction. The inspector, whatever his limitations, understood that a public exposition of the crime would serve both justice and the Yard's reputation. Mrs. Vale, pale and composed in her widow's black, sat rigid in her accustomed chair. Mr. Crowle, sweating despite the moderate temperature, occupied the sofa. Sims and Miss Merrow stood near the door, their faces reflecting that mixture of fascination and horror which sensational crimes inspire in decent people. The morning sun, breaking through for once, fell through the lace curtains in patterns that dappled the carpet with light and shadow. Even the idol in its glass case seemed less sinister in daylight, merely a piece of carved wood, its gilded grin reduced to theatre prop status. Holmes stood before the fireplace in that characteristic pose, head slightly back, hands clasped behind him, every inch the Victorian gentleman conducting a lecture. Yet his eyes held that hunting intensity I knew so well, and his voice, though conversational, carried an edge of steel. "We are blessed," he began, "to live in an age and nation where men prefer a conjurer's flourish to an executioner's blade, where sensation is valued above simple violence. Yet even the most elaborate theatrical effect must yield to systematic inquiry. Mr. Ambrose Vale died of strychnine poisoning, cunningly introduced into his snuff. The manner of death, the locked room, the anonymous warning, the theatrical references to Eastern curses, all were designed to mislead, to direct investigation toward the impossible and the supernatural." He paused, allowing his words to settle upon the assembled company, like frost upon glass. Let us consider first the locked room. To the casual observer, the study appeared to have been secured from within. Door locked, key visible in the interior lock, window nailed shut. Yet this apparent impossibility dissolved upon application of proper method. From his pocket he produced the length of horsehair and the cake of beeswax, holding them up for all to observe. These simple materials, combined with patience and a knowledge of theatrical effects, suffice to create the illusion of a locked room. The key is manipulated from outside by means of a thread passed through the keyhole, turned in the lock, drawn through, rotated, and reinserted from the interior. The only trace is a faint line in any accumulated dust beneath the door, a detail our observant Miss Merrow noted, but did not understand. Miss Merrow coloured slightly at being mentioned, while Sims nodded slowly, his expression troubled. "The poison itself," Holmes continued, "was introduced through the snuff-box's hidden compartment, a feature common in silver boxes of that period, designed to conceal particularly precious blends. This compartment was opened clumsily, leaving tool marks upon the inner lid. The strychnine was masked with quinine to disguise its characteristic bitterness, and the presence of indigo riddle dust in the regular snuff provided partial explanation for the blue staining that resulted from contact with the chemist's poison wrapper tissue." He moved to the table where Vale's snuff-box rested, picking it up and angling it toward the light. "Observe these scratches, minute but definite, the marks of a metal probe forced against the spring mechanism. A surgical instrument, in fact, a whalebone probe of the sort physicians use for certain delicate procedures. Traces of the blue-stained strychnine were found upon just such an instrument in Dr. Alderney's medical bag." Mrs. Vale had gone very white, her gloved hands clenched in her lap. Crowle swallowed audibly, his florid face sheening with perspiration. "The anonymous note and brass token," Holmes continued relentlessly, "were designed to suggest ancient curses and supernatural agency. He shall smile when Semna grins, a reference to that theatrical idol in Mr. Vale's collection, a piece of Eastern exotica that any visitor to this house would recognize. Yet the note was penned in violet copying ink of a distinctive shade, a shade precisely matching the bottle kept upon Dr. Alderney's desk for medical records and prescriptions. The brass token itself was rubbed with this same ink to enhance the impression. He set down the snuff-box and turned to face his audience directly. The smile, that dreadful rictus which suggested tetanus or supernatural intervention, was in fact the risus sardonicus characteristic of strychnine poisoning. The facial muscles contract in a characteristic pattern as the poison affects the nervous system. Doctor. Alderney, with his medical knowledge, understood this perfectly. Indeed, he attempted to direct investigation toward tetanus, knowing the similarity of symptoms would provide confusion and delay. "This is monstrous!" Dr. Alderney burst out, though his voice lacked conviction. He had been brought from police custody specifically for this confrontation, flanked by 2 solid constables. "You construct a case from coincidences and supposition." Holmes regarded him with something approaching pity. "Coincidence, Doctor, is merely causation imperfectly understood. Let us review the evidence systematically. A cabman places you at the lane behind this house between 11 and midnight on the night of the murder, a time you claim to have been at home. He remembers you particularly for your fussing about the fair, and, more significantly, for the smell of violets clinging to your gloves." "The violet ink," Dr. Alderney whispered, as though the words were being drawn from him against his will. "Precisely. The same ink that appears on the anonymous note. Further, the blue ash found in Vale's fireplace derives from the distinctive tissue paper used by your former associate's chemist for wrapping poisons. A torn fragment of this paper, bearing the letters STRYCHN, was recovered from those ashes where you had attempted to burn it. The chemist's ledger shows a purchase of strychnine signed in your hand, poorly disguised but recognizable through certain characteristic letter formations." Holmes's voice had remained level throughout, almost gentle, but beneath the silk I heard adamant conviction. "You had means, medical knowledge, access to poisons, familiarity with the locked room trick through theatrical connections. You had opportunity, regular visits to this house in your capacity as physician, access to Vale's study, knowledge of his habits, including his use of snuff, and you had motive." He paused, his gaze moving to Mrs. Vale, who sat frozen as though carved from marble. "Love, or what you believed to be love. The desire to rescue a woman you perceived as imprisoned in an unhappy marriage. Mrs. Vale's complaints about her husband's emotional cruelty, his treatment of her as another exhibit in his collection of curiosities. These fell upon soil already prepared by infatuation to receive them as a call to action. "I loved her," Dr. Alderney said simply, his voice breaking. "He was cruel, Mr. Holmes. He collected people as he collected those masks and idols, arranging them for his amusement, fixing expressions upon their faces. He made Isadora into another of his exhibits, the faded beauty, the diminished star. I wanted only to free her, to give her the life she deserved, the appreciation she merited. Your motives," Holmes said coldly, "are for a higher tribunal than mine. I concern myself with facts, with evidence, with the determination of truth. The facts are these. You obtained strychnine under false pretenses. You tampered with Vale's snuff-box, introducing poison into its hidden compartment. You manipulated the key to create the locked room illusion. You wrote the anonymous note to suggest supernatural agency. And you were present when the body was discovered, establishing yourself as witness and would-be diagnostician rather than suspect. He turned to Lestrade. Inspector, the case is complete. The Crown will have no difficulty in obtaining a conviction. Lestrade stepped forward, his face grim. Julius Alderney, you have heard the evidence against you. Do you wish to make any statement? Dr. Alderney's shoulders sagged, all the fight draining from him like water from a cracked vessel. He cast one final glance at Mrs. Vale, a look of such naked longing and despair that even I, accustomed as I was to the darker aspects of human nature, felt a twinge of pity. I did it for love, he whispered. I thought, I believed. He broke off, unable to continue. Mrs. Vale remained motionless, her face averted, and in that deliberate turning away, I read volumes. Whether she had consciously encouraged his attachment, whether she had suspected or even desired his crime, these questions would never be answered with certainty. She was an actress, trained in the art of presentation, and she would carry her secrets with her. As Lestrade led the doctor away, the drawing-room seemed to exhale collectively, as though a poisonous miasma had been lifted. Crowell poured himself brandy with trembling hands. Miss Merrow wiped her eyes with her apron. Sims stood with bowed head, his face a study in troubled contemplation. Holmes remained by the fireplace, his expression distant. There are 3 types of smile, he said quietly, almost to himself. The smile of genuine pleasure, which comes from the heart. The smile of social convention, which comes from training and habit. And the smile of death, which comes from poison and muscle spasm. Mr. Vale died, wearing the 3rd type, and the world mistook physiology for curse, chemistry for supernatural intervention. It is my profession to distinguish between these categories. As we prepared to depart, Mrs. Vale rose and approached Holmes. Her composure had returned, that trained control which allowed the theatrical to survive their own tragedies. You have been very thorough, Mr. Holmes, she said, her voice steady. Justice will be served. Justice, Holmes replied neutrally, is a concept for courts and philosophers. I merely establish facts. And facts, she said softly, can be as cruel as any curse. Facts are neither cruel nor kind, madam. They simply are. We left her standing by the window, backlit by morning sun, a figure that might have stepped from one of her own theatrical productions. The tragic widow, the beautiful victim, the woman whose sorrows had driven another to murder. Whether she grieved for her husband or for her devoted physician, whether she felt guilt or merely relief, I could not determine. The actress's mask remained firmly in place. That evening, back in our Baker Street sanctuary, Holmes stretched upon the settee with a cigarette, his long frame relaxed, but his eyes still bright with residual mental activity. The fog had returned to claim the streets below, and I could hear the call of the lamplighters as they went about their evening rounds, climbing their iron ladders to kindle the gas jets that would push back the darkness for another night. You see, Watson, he said, breaking the companionable silence, a smile may be many things, a mask to hide true feelings, a signal to communicate meaning, or a seizure of muscle tissue following the introduction of alkaloid poison. The world insists upon mystery, upon supernatural explanation, upon the exotic and the impossible. Nature, however, insists upon method, upon causation, upon the prosaic mechanisms of chemistry and physiology. Between these two insistences, the human hunger for wonder and the natural imperative of law, a poor fellow may lose his way entirely. He drew upon his cigarette, exhaling fragrant smoke toward the shadowed ceiling. Dr. Alderney convinced himself he was the hero of a romantic drama, the knight rescuing the imprisoned lady. In reality, he was merely a murderer who used his medical knowledge and his victim's own habits to commit a calculated crime. The locked room, the Eastern idol, the anonymous warning, all theatrical misdirection designed to obscure a simple truth. He poisoned Vale with strychnine and arranged the scene to suggest impossibility. "And Mrs. Vale?" I asked. "You believe she bears no culpability?" Holmes was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. "Culpability is a graduated concept, Watson. She did not poison her husband, did not turn the key, did not write the anonymous note. Yet she created, whether consciously or unconsciously, the emotional atmosphere in which murder became conceivable to an infatuated mind. She complained of cruelty, implied imprisonment, suggested that her life would be better without her husband. Whether these complaints were legitimate or theatrical, I cannot determine with certainty. But I know this: words have consequences, and the actress who speaks them bears some responsibility for how they are heard." He stubbed out his cigarette and rose, moving to the window where he stood, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street. "The case is closed, Watson. Dr. Alderney will stand trial, will likely hang, and Mrs. Vale will inherit her husband's estate and collection. The newspapers will feature the sensational elements, the locked room, the grinning corpse, the Eastern idol. They will speak of curses and mysteries. But you and I know the truth. It was merely chemistry and cunning, alkaloid and artifice, human weakness disguised as impossible crime." I joined him at the window, watching as a lamplighter completed his rounds and descended from his final ladder, his torch guttering in the fog. Below, the street was transformed. The gas lamps created islands of light in an ocean of darkness, and between them moved shadows that might have been anything: pedestrians hurrying home, criminals seeking opportunity, or merely honest folk going about their business under the cover of London's perpetual twilight. "Do you ever wonder," I asked, "whether some mysteries are better left unsolved? Whether the exposure of human wickedness serves any purpose beyond satisfying our need for justice?" Holmes turned to look at me, and in the dim light his face was sharp and austere as a medieval saint's. "Mystery unsolved is superstition, Watson. Superstition breeds fear, fear breeds cruelty, and cruelty breeds more crime. Every locked room I open, every impossible crime I explain, is a small victory against the forces of ignorance. When men cease to believe in curses, they become more difficult to manipulate. When they understand that death follows from poison rather than from supernatural agency, they become more careful whom they trust." He placed a hand upon my shoulder, a rare gesture from one so habitually reserved. "You ask whether justice serves a purpose. I answer, yes, if only to establish that the universe operates according to comprehensible principles. A man died wearing a terrible smile, and his household believed in ancient curses. Now they know he was murdered by someone he trusted, through methods that can be understood and prevented. That knowledge, however painful, is preferable to superstitious dread. You make it sound almost noble, I observed. It is necessary, he corrected. Nobility is for poets and priests. I am merely a consulting detective who applies reason to chaos, method to mystery, and in doing so demonstrates that the universe, however cruel, is at least consistent in its cruelty. The lamplighter had vanished into the fog, leaving behind only his lamps burning in their solitary vigil. I thought of the idol with its gilded grin, now revealed as merely wood and gilt. I thought of Dr. Alderney in his cell, facing the consequences of love perverted into murder. I thought of Mrs. Vale, alone in her house of curiosities, surrounded by masks and stage properties that mirrored the masks we all wear in society's great theatre. And I thought of Ambrose Vale himself, dead in his locked study, his final expression a physiological accident that had been mistaken for supernatural judgment. The case is closed, I said, echoing Holmes's words, but its image remains. As it should, Holmes replied. Memory is the enemy of repeated error. Those who forget the patterns of crime are doomed to become either its perpetrators or its victims. He moved away from the window, and his voice took on that practical tone which indicated he had finished with philosophy and was ready to return to the immediate. Now then, Watson, Mrs. Hudson has left cold chicken and pickles, and I am suddenly ravenous. The exercise of reason always produces in me a healthy appetite. Shall we dine, and then perhaps a pipe and the evening paper? I see that Lestrade has released the official statement, no doubt taking full credit for the solution, as is his custom. And you don't mind? I asked, knowing his indifference to public recognition. Mind? My dear fellow, I prefer it. Official credit brings official responsibility, and official responsibility brings official supervision. I am content to remain what I have always been, an unofficial consulting detective, available to those who appreciate subtle reasoning and utterly unavailable to those who do not. We settled into our evening routine with that comfortable ease which marks the friendship of men who have shared danger and survived it together. Holmes ate with surprising appetite, discoursed upon the deficiencies of Lestrade's methodology, played a few melancholy airs upon his violin, and finally subsided into his chair with the evening papers spread across his knees. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows upon the walls where our collection of curiosities, bullet marks, chemical apparatus, stacks of reference volumes, testified to years of investigation into human nature's darker recesses. The fog pressed against our windows like a living thing, but inside all was warmth and light and the peculiar satisfaction that comes from work well done. Holmes, I said, as the clock struck 11 and I prepared to retire, do you suppose Dr. Alderney truly believed he was acting nobly, that he convinced himself murder was justified? Holmes looked up from his papers, his eyes thoughtful. Oh, undoubtedly, Watson. Men rarely commit atrocities while acknowledging them as such. We are all the heroes of our own narratives, the protagonists of our own moral dramas. Dr. Alderney cast himself as the gallant rescuer, Mrs. Vale as the imprisoned innocent, and Vale as the cruel tyrant. That this narrative bore little resemblance to reality, that Mrs. Vale was calculating rather than innocent, that Vale was merely difficult rather than tyrannical, that Alderney himself was obsessed rather than devoted. These facts were inconvenient to his story, and so he ignored them. And the truth, I pressed, the truth, my dear Watson, is that a lonely physician became infatuated with a beautiful patient, mistook her complaints for an invitation, and murdered her husband in the deluded belief that he was performing a noble service. There is nothing exotic in this, nothing mysterious, nothing worthy of sensation fiction. It is merely one more variation on the eternal theme of love and death, played out in a London suburb with props borrowed from theatrical warehouses. He returned to his papers, and I knew the conversation was ended. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I reflected upon the curious nature of Holmes's vocation. He dealt daily with the worst aspects of human nature: greed, jealousy, rage, and calculated malice. Yet he maintained his belief in reason, in method, in the power of observation and deduction to illuminate even the darkest corners of human behavior. The case of the grinning coin had begun with mystery and ended with explanation. A locked room had yielded to horsehair and wax. A supernatural curse had dissolved into alkaloid chemistry. An impossible crime had been revealed as merely improbable, requiring only knowledge and opportunity to accomplish. And a smile that had seemed the mark of ancient vengeance had proven to be nothing more than muscle spasm following poison ingestion. Yet for all Holmes's rationalism, for all his insistence upon natural causes and human agency, I could not entirely banish the image of that gilded idol, grinning its mindless grin in its glass case. Semna, the sole spirit of Javanese legend, had watched the entire drama unfold. The poison prepared, the snuff contaminated, the key manipulated, the death throes, the investigation, and finally the arrest. And though Holmes had proven it was merely carved wood, given meaning by superstition, still that grin seemed to carry some deeper significance, some reminder that beneath our veneer of civilization and reason, we remain creatures capable of the most primitive passions and the most calculated cruelties. The fog had thickened to absolute obscurity by the time I finally slept, and my dreams were troubled by images of masks and idols, of locked rooms and manipulated keys, of smiles both genuine and false, and of that terrible final grin that had greeted dawn in a locked study in St. John's Wood. But in the morning, London would wake to clarity. The fog lifted, the mystery solved, the guilty punished, and order restored to a world that constantly threatens to dissolve into chaos. It is this restoration of order, I think, that gives Holmes's work its meaning, not the punishment of the guilty, though that follows inevitably, not the protection of the innocent, though that too is achieved, but rather the demonstration that the universe operates according to principles we can comprehend, that mystery yields to method, that even the most theatrical of crimes can be reduced to its essential components and understood. The case was closed, the lamp was relit, and in Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes, that most rational of men, had once again proven that reason could triumph over superstition, that method could illuminate mystery, and that even death's most terrible smile was merely chemistry wearing the mask of curse. It is one of life's cruelties that even a smile, that most human of gestures, may be twisted into a mask of terror. Ambrose Vail's fate reminds us how superstition can be wielded as a weapon, and how reason alone can strip it bare. Holmes, as ever, dismissed sentiment with a curl of his lip, yet his final words lingered with me. Beware, Watson, of those who would force happiness upon others. It is ever the prelude to tyranny. If this tale captured you, I invite you to subscribe to Detective Street for more untold cases of Sherlock Holmes, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Until the next case, keep your lamp burning, and beware the fog.